Hello and welcome to the CNU Midwest Changemakers webcast. My name is John Young. I'm the lead planning consultant for Urban Fast Forward, and joining me today as co-host is Christina Anderson from the city of Kalamazoo, Michigan. CNU Midwest Changemakers is a partnership between CNU Midwest, CNU Michigan, and CNU Illinois, and we're dedicated to bringing interesting conversations and stories about the Midwest to our audience out there in the internets. So I'd also, I guess, ask Christina, what do you do at the city of Kalamazoo?
Oh, I'm the city planner. I run the planning division for the city.
Excellent, excellent. So one thing I do want to say is that there is a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and if you have a question about our conversation anytime during that time, just go ahead and click on that and write your question into the Q&A box, and we will ask that question to our panelists today at the end of our discussion. So without further ado, I'll have Christina go ahead and introduce our guest today.
Thanks, John. Welcome, everybody, for today's discussion. So we are really excited to have two great folks for our discussion today. The first is Tom Carroll. Tom Carroll is the village manager for Silverton, Ohio. In 2018, he was one of 4 ICMA local government research fellows studying the leading practices that first suburbs used to revitalize. A past president of the Ohio City County Management Association, he is working to develop a first suburbs revitalization user's manual with ICMA. Our second guest today is Eric Wobser. Eric is the city manager for the city of Sandusky. Sandusky native with a significant experience in municipal government and community development. Eric previously served as the special projects manager to the mayor of the city of Cleveland from 2006 to 2009, and executive director of the Ohio City Incorporated from late 2009 through June of 2014. So welcome to both of our guests today.
Thank you.
Awesome. So before we get started, I also want to thank CNU, Congress for Urbanism, for being a sponsor for this event, as well as CalFi and CalFi Zoning for being our host. With that said, I do want to start our conversation with Tom here. Both of you guys come from communities that have long and interesting histories, distinct assets, and have witnessed some population decline in the last 40 years or so. Can you tell us about your community as well as the assets and challenges?
Sure. Thank you, John. Thank you, Christina. So Silverton is a Cincinnati first suburb. We border Cincinnati on 2 of our 4 sides. And like most Midwestern first suburbs, our boom years were right after World War II. So if you think of our housing stock, you can probably imagine it as full of ranch homes and Cape Cods that were mass produced in the late 40s and 50s. We do have an older section of town with older homes, but most of our building took place about 50 to 70 years ago. So Silverton is the classic Midwestern first suburb, mostly residential in our land use makeup. And in the late 1960s and early 70s, the community integrated relatively quickly. Silverton is very evenly split between black and white. We're 52% black, 45% white, 3% offended at the question. Like most first suburbs, we have been steadily losing population for the last 50 years. So our high water mark in terms of population was in 1960 at about 6,600, and then every census afterwards we have lost 300-400 residents, and in 2010 we dipped below 5,000 residents, which in Ohio means that we become a village again. So we've been known as the city of Silverton until 2011. Most of our commercial stock, which is very limited, is pretty outdated, and we're about a mile from the Kenwood Town Center, which is the Cincinnati area's major retail hub. So there's not a lot of retail space since we're in competition with what's nearby. So my challenge has been over the last 7 years to figure out how do we as one first suburb try and turn ourselves around. So that's Silverton in a nutshell.
Eric, how about you?
So Sandusky has somewhat similar demographics to Silverton, but is different in the sense that we're not necessarily a suburb of any community. We're a small city anchor of a more rural region of north central Ohio. We sit about 60 miles from Cleveland to the east and 60 miles from Toledo to the west, in a 4-county region that is pretty decentralized, that we refer to as the Firelands, of about 230,000 people. Sandusky's population is a little over 25,000. My guess is we'll probably dip a little below that after the census results come out this year, which people are paying close attention to locally. And that'll be the first time we've fallen below 25,000 for a long time. Our population peaked a little bit later than Silverton's in the early 1980s, and that's because we saw a wave of auto manufacturing that really hit the 50s here. We had both a GM plant and a Ford plant that were built in the 50s just outside of the city limits. Sandusky's actual original growth occurred predominantly in the 19th century. It was a hub for lakefront tourism, but also the ice industry, freshwater fishing, and paper. Unfortunately, technology displaced all of those early industries, and it became more reliant on tourism until the auto boom. And after the auto boom was sort of a mix of manufacturing as well as tourism. Really in the late 80s until now, we've seen a big decline in Sandusky. We've been hit hard by globalization. Both those GM and Ford plants are gone. One of them is completely shuttered, and another is a subsidiary parts maker that though is employing significantly fewer employees at significantly lower wages. We still have a pretty strong hub of manufacturing, but when most people think about Sandusky, they think of us as a tourism town. And that's in large part because we are the home of Cedar Point, which is the oldest, the second oldest continually operating amusement park in the world, and also the largest seasonal outdoor amusement park. And the seasonal aspects of that are important because it kind of makes the economy somewhat seasonal in nature. And we've worked really hard to kind of diversify and to rebalance that. Sandusky is a very proudly diverse city. I believe a little over a third of our residents identify either as Black or biracial. And then we have a smaller percentage of other racial diversity in the city, and then a largely white population. But we're aging demographically, and that's something that we're paying a lot of close attention to, is that to the extent that you see younger families in the region, there tend to be sprouting up in the sort of rural and suburban areas outside of Sandusky. But we've been working really hard to position ourselves as the hub of this region from a cultural and an economic and a diversity perspective, and to pivot from what is a seasonal tourism destination to what we're calling a destination economy with more year-round tourism, but also a lifestyle here that can attract 21st century economic development.
Cool, thanks.
Thanks for that background. So understanding kind of where you are in each of your communities, can you both talk about how the quality of the public realm, the built environment, and more resilient development patterns have affected your jobs as city and village manager? And this time we'll start with Eric, and then Tom, we'll have you follow up.
Certainly, that's been a real focus of us, of ours over the last several years. I've been in place since 2014, and we went through a citywide strategic visioning process throughout the entire year of 2015, in which we engaged every neighborhood within the city of Sandusky, and really talked about how we unlocked our potential of the community by working with our residents. And we've been hit really hard by a lot of the challenges that we have faced, which I think are unique to a lot of urban manufacturing centers within Ohio and the surrounding Midwest. But what we really wanted to do was sort of pivot from talking exclusively about the challenges that we were facing as a community and focusing on our assets, which we thought were truly unique. And those assets, as they were defined during that process by doing outreach to our stakeholders with the residents of Sandusky, were our history, that 19th century built historic downtown and surrounding historic neighborhoods, the diversity of the city, which we think had been sort of exploited maybe by some of our neighboring communities as they tried to draw population from Sandusky. I definitely think there was at least subliminal racism in play in Sandusky. that we wanted to celebrate being the one diverse community. So we're the county seat of Erie County. 90% of the racial diversity in Erie County, or nearly 90% of the racial diversity in Erie County, is in the city of Sandusky. And in fact, over 60% of the racial diversity in a 4-county region of north central Ohio is in the city of Sandusky. And so we wanted to flip that and say that we were the cultural city, the diversity, the integrated community. We've tried to do that. And then the tourism, how do we sort of rebuild around the assets that we have and really take advantage of being a waterfront community and take advantage of being a tourism community in ways that worked for all of our residents. And so we started by saying, okay, what is working here as we look at those 3 strengths, which are our historic building stock, our waterfront, and the opportunities for tourism, as well as our diversity. And we built a plan that sort of unified those things together and created an opportunity to make some major investments. So we set aside resources specifically through a tax issue that we passed in 2014. We were able to set aside resources specifically for economic development and for improving our historic housing stock. And then we really focused on public realm redevelopment through a few things. One is we created a plan for the Sandusky Bay Pathway, which has a goal of building a waterfront bike trail that will link the entire city limits and hopefully eventually become a regional trail. We built the first mile of that trail last year in our downtown along Shoreline Drive and have another 4 miles of that are under design and are funded. We also took what was a 300-space parking lot and turned that into the Jackson Street Pier project, which became a public space. That was an $8 million redevelopment. Finance through tax income financing, and really created a focal point for Sandusky residents and both regional residents, local residents, and tourists to have a gathering place in the center of downtown. And it's been tremendously popular in its first year of operation, even with everything that's happened with COVID. So we very much focused on that. And then we have tried to take advantage of the inherent advantages that we have as it relates to being historic. We are much more walkable by design because of when our community was built out. But we, instead of really trying to embrace that, and tried to become more like some of our suburban neighbors in the past. As we tried to flip that script and say, no, let's slow things down. Let's create more 4-way stops and other traffic calming measures and really push walking and biking as a viable alternative because it's something that we can offer that not a lot of the other communities in our region can offer. And I think we've found a lot of success with that over the past few years.
Thanks, Eric. Tom?
Yeah, so Silverton is like a lot of the Midwest, where I would describe our public realm as being kind of dated and in some ways there's a lot of charm to that, but in some ways there's a lot of obsolescence to it. So when I look at the housing stock, it was a real mixed bag where some of the homes were very well maintained and prosperous looking and others had simply fallen behind. And so we've made a major effort on code enforcement. Council is very unified, and that's not glitzy, that is not fun, but it's so important. And we've found that a way to approach it is hire people who have good judgment to know when you need a little bit of a heavy hand to get something done, and when you need a helping hand to achieve the same outcome. So we're doing a lot of work on housing stabilization and eviction prevention from that aging housing stock. Our commercial buildings are very obsolete, and so a big part of the program has been to demolish them and to create land assemblage, which is a challenge in a built-out environment like Silverton, and where land uses were put in place 70, 80 years ago. We have found that the village itself has to take the lead on land assemblage in order to change the built environment. And so we did a major project on the eastern edge of our commercial area where the village bought and assembled 10 acres of land, demolished most of the property that was there, including some single family homes, some of which were nice, but they were just in the way. And we acquired them through fair market value acquisitions, and then turned that over to a developer to do a major mixed use redevelopment. It doesn't quite, it's new urbanist mixed use development, so it's different from what's around it, but that change in land use that assemblage that we took the lead on was pivotal in helping a lot of other private investment and interest in those private homes. The only other thing I'll mention in terms of the built environment, and this is something that I don't know if this is going to be a best practice that we can take out of this, but it's a fun story. We, the village, bought a funeral home out of foreclosure and renovated it, and that's now our town hall. And our old municipal building is now a brewery. So the best practice takeaway is if you ever get a chance to buy a funeral home, do it and renovate it. But it's how you took the building that we were in was built in 1951 and was Art Deco, but was very obsolete as a town hall. Nothing was accessible. It just was clunky. I think people were a lot skinnier back then. The bathrooms were very narrow. And so we turned it over to the private sector that could salvage the historic value of it, but make it retrofit. And it's a very cool brewery. And the space that we renovated was a funeral home that would have been a very hard reuse of the space, and it works really well for our town hall. So that's how I would describe our built environment. We're trying to reinvigorate and revitalize and do land assemblage to change the built environment, which is obsolete.
I would have to say, I think retrofitting a funeral home is very in keeping in the spirit of Halloween right now. It seems like a pretty good alternative.
The humor opportunities for having a government in a formal funeral home, death and taxes, it's just been endless stream of comedic opportunity.
Nice. And I think High Grain is the brewery you're talking about. And so
it is, yeah.
So keeping with you, Tom, Silverton recently completed a small area plan, the Plainfield Road small area plan. Can you tell us a little bit about the impetus for the plan and the main priorities for implementing that plan in that area?
Yeah, it's a great follow-up to the changing the built environment. Plainfield Road is, there's only about, I would call it 3 blocks of land just north of Montgomery Road. Montgomery Road is also known as US 3 and State Route 22. It is a major roadway. It bisects Silverton right down the middle, and it has about 30,000 cars a day going through Montgomery Road. So no matter what we do from a changing the built environment standpoint, Montgomery Road is always going to feel busy. And so we're going to do a lot of things to revitalize. We already have been, but we recognize that it's never going to feel like a true Norman Rockwell downtown. So Plainfield Road, which is just north, has more like 10,000 cars a day, and it's all local traffic. It's all people who live around that area. And so our goal with the Plainfield Road small area plan is to make it a much more pedestrian scale, to revitalize a lot of the buildings, which again are obsolete, some of which are just going to need to come down. Our mayor sometimes talks about putting a bulldozer in drive with a half a tank of gas, and when it runs out, that's where we'll stop the demolition. Because there's a whole one side of the street that is just basically a combination of old and rundown homes and old rundown spaces that might have once been retail but haven't been for 60 or 70 years. So the whole idea is to make that our central business district. And that is what we're trying to do. And there's going to be a mixture of land uses and a change in the way those land uses are, including residential. We see a residential component as being very important in our revitalization efforts.
Very cool. So that's going to be like a mix of just kind of like bringing back kind of a new infill retail with residential on top. Kind of
right. And retail, to be a little bit more clear, it's probably not going to be where you buy a pair of jeans or a dress or shoes. It's going to be services and restaurants, that type of thing. Place to work out, a place to get your hair done or something like that. It's not going to be traditional retail in the sense of there's probably not going to be a lot you buy there to take home.
Right on. So thanks, Tom. Eric, Bowling Green University announced earlier this year that it'll be opening a campus in Sandusky's downtown. Now, prior to this, you had 50 new businesses opening up down there in downtown and over $100 million in investment since you started. Can you talk about the strategies that you took to attract so much activity in such a small Ohio city? And what do you think the effect the university will have on being in downtown Sandusky?
Sure, thanks, John. And for those who haven't been to downtown Sandusky, it is this jewel of beautiful historic housing stock. There's probably a core portion of the downtown that is 3 blocks by 3 blocks, and then it kind of tapers off to the east and west from there along the Sandusky Bay, and then to the south tapers into historic residential neighborhoods. And like a lot of downtowns over the last 30 or 40 years, retail left the downtown. Some of the office that was in the downtown left. There was a mall that was built in Sandusky, I want to say in the late 70s, the Sandusky Mall, that basically slowly but surely took all of the retail. And so when you find downtown Sandusky, which isn't easy to get to, it's not naturally off of any travel patterns, either to tourism assets like Cedar Point, or alternatively, it's a few miles from any interchange exit, so it's not naturally intuitive to get there. So it had declined a lot as the city had declined. And when we began planning for the city's future as part of the bicentennial vision plan, one of the things that we knew we needed to do to bring competitiveness back to the city of Sandusky was for it to have a strong hub and anchor in downtown Sandusky. And there is not a planner or developer or a person who has a civic interest who wouldn't look at this and say it is a great jewel and has incredible potential. And so it was really not difficult for us to reimagine what it would be. In addition to the things that I already mentioned, it also has 3 active ferry operations that exist to help people get to the Lake Erie Islands. And so we had some built-in advantages. There's a historic theater, but again, it had just been tired for probably about 30 or 40 years, and they had lost some of the significant buildings. We wanted to make sure we could stop that and rebuild around it. There had been a few entrepreneurs that had opened restaurants and businesses maybe about a decade ago and had great success. It was really a matter of just taking that sort of entrepreneurial spirit to the next level. And the way that we were able to do that, in addition to the BGSU campus, which I will segue into, is we partnered with our civic institutions, including Cedar Point, including Fire Island Regional Medical Center, Civista Bank, some of our local philanthropic entities. And we put something on the ballot in fall of 2014 that was called Issue 8. And that was a joint income and admissions tax increase. Sandusky had never actually passed an income tax increase in its municipal history, other than the 1% that was allowed by state law, because there's always been this sense that Cedar Point is a major driver of revenue on a per capita basis. They have something that generates that much activity and pays an admissions tax and then contributes to lodging taxes. We get a disproportionate amount of those on a per capita basis, probably compared to anywhere in Ohio. But we had been struggling, we had been declining. And so we really kind of brought together the business and civic community and our residents and said, let's create some shared investment around the plan, which became the bicentennial vision plan. And building a destination downtown, as we called it, became one of the focal points of that plan. And so we actually set aside 1/2 of the increase in admissions taxes for economic development programs that we really coupled with things like the state historic tax credit, the federal historic tax credit, new market tax credits, to make projects in the restoration of our historic buildings downtown more viable. It became like an equity piece. We would do up to 10% of eligible cost of a project. And I think we've had close to 20 individual buildings that have been renovated in our downtown over the last 5 years, some of which are as big as 60 to 70,000 square feet, some of which are as small as just a few thousand square feet. But those are the buildings that have brought in the new residents. We actually have a historic city hall project as well that is not as cool as a funeral home, but was an old bank building that we partnered with Bruce Brothers Development out of Cleveland and restored that for our administrative offices, as well as 18 market rate apartments and then 3 commercial storefronts. And because we're a tenant in that building with an option to purchase after the tax credits expire, we were able to leverage new market credits, state credits, and historic credits. We also continued to partner beyond the tax increase with folks like Cedar Point and Bowling Green, where we noticed that we're an undereducated market on a regional basis. It's one of the things that keeps us from attracting a lot of economic development, is that if you compare us as a region to a lot of other regions, we do not have a strong presence of higher education or educational attainment within the region. And so we had a branch campus of BGSU that was in somewhat of a remote location. although we've made investments in public transportation to try to create better connectivity there, having an actual campus environment and a new academic program, which is the Center for Resort and Attraction Management in partnership with Cedar Fair, led to about a $15 million investment, a 78,000 square foot new construction building that sits on a former surface parking lot within the downtown and has both the classroom facility on the first floor and then housing marketed towards students on the upper 4 floors of that. It actually has it just opened a few weeks ago, and then we have the ribbon cutting on October 30th, and we're really proud of that. In just I guess next week. But the City Hall project was an anchor to the downtown. The BGSU project is an anchor for the downtown. We've worked on a few other anchor projects and then really infilled using that admissions tax funds to make viable new small businesses in the restoration of these historic buildings. And then we've really tied all that together with the public realm with things like the Shoreline Drive and the Jackson Street Pier projects. And it sort of really is part of a sort of a cohesive plan that we implemented in the previous 5 years. And folks like City Architecture out of Cleveland worked on the Jackson Street Pier project and the citywide master plan. Environmental Design Group out of the Akron area is helping with that pathway plan. And we're currently actually working with MKSK based out of Columbus on a new downtown plan to say, okay, this is everything we've accomplished in the last 5 years. What has that made possible to accomplish over the next 5 years? So in spite of all of the impact of COVID-19, it's been a really exciting time in Sandusky, particularly the downtown, which has really taken off and creating more market strength in the neighborhoods surrounding the historic downtown.
Wow, that's great. So, I mean, so your admissions tax, you're basically using part of that to basically cover gap financing for some of these catalytic projects. You're putting together. Go ahead.
We've dedicated $550,000 annually. Now our admissions tax is going to be impacted by COVID this year, so it's based on previous year's admissions tax collection. And we've coupled that with other resources that we've historically had available for development. But we've used that for a fund for small business grants for either new or expanding small businesses, a facade and signage program that we call catalytic reinvestments, which is where that equity piece of up to 10% comes in. And a few of those we'll do on a multi-year basis. I think the Bowling Green State University project is the largest one we've made so far, which was a total of $1 million paid out over a period of, I think, 4 years. So that gives you a sense that we'll actually make our last payment on that project, I believe, next year. And so we were trying to leverage catalytic larger scale developments, the repurposing of historic building stock. And in addition to that, we also dedicated a portion of the income tax increase to housing and blight elimination. So we have kind of a mirror image residential program that is working to kind of stabilize and drive rehabilitation of neighborhood housing stock in addition to the admissions tax dollars, which are primarily paid by tourists and are kind of anchoring that downtown redevelopment.
Cool. Thanks, Eric.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, I think that public-private partnership, institution partnership is critical as cities are trying to reinvent themselves with losses of traditional revenue sources, that looking to those other solutions are going to be key for cities. So Tom, with that, you have written and presented a lot about first suburbs and several features in some ICMA publications. Could you talk to us about your research on first suburbs generally and what you've done in Silverton to transform it from a city that has lost population to one that is creating jobs, building tax revenue, all while facilitating walkable urbanism and a strong community spirit? I know, when I was doing some research, your curbside chats I found to be a great way of reaching out to the public. And so kind of balancing I'd love for you to balance your answer between the brick and mortars, which is what most of what our discussion is today, that physical realm, with also that important piece of the community and public.
I'll do my best. So the research I've done on first suburbs at a very macro level, my conclusion is around the Midwest and around the country, most of the first suburbs are having the same type of experiences. And I boil it down to this. The American middle class has shrunk. It just has, by any sociological or economic metric. And it stands to reason that if we have fewer people in the middle class, we're going to have fewer middle class communities. In places like Silverton and Reading and North College Hill and Mount Healthy around us, and then there's the equivalent around Chicago and Detroit and Cleveland and you name it. Many of these first suburbs that were created as working class or middle class residential communities aren't middle class anymore. So that's where the essence of the struggle is coming from. So there's no silver bullet to go against these macroeconomic trends. That said, when I was researching best practices, I found that there are probably 4 key areas where I think people can try and move the needle and stabilize, if not reverse decline, in a first suburb. And this would probably apply anywhere in the Midwest, even if it's not in a first suburban context. And the first is around governance. And in Silverton context, we eliminated our police department and contracted with the Hamilton County Sheriff's Office, which a lot of townships in Ohio do that already. So it's not like this is unheard of. It is unusual for a municipality to do it. But that saved us money each year, and we are able to demonstrate that we're getting as good or better services for a lot less money. And then we were able to reinvest that money into infrastructure and economic development. The bottom line with communities that are struggling financially, you really can't always raise taxes or raise revenue with other means if the economic pie is getting smaller. And so the way to do it is to reallocate the money. And that's what we did. And I'm not necessarily proposing everybody eliminate their police department, don't get me wrong. I'm just saying that we have examples where business models that were put in place in the 1950s or 60s when economic conditions were very different, we're still wedded to them and we can't afford them anymore. So an honest and thorough examination of your governance structures is key to figuring out how to free up resources to invest in roads and housing and the other things. Housing is the second component. What I realized when I'm starting to do research on most of the first suburbs, about 70 to 90% of their economic activity comes from the housing market. There are, of course, suburbs that are much more evenly balanced, commercial, residential. But for most of the first suburbs that are struggling, they are residential heavy. And I realized that municipalities like my own really don't spend a lot of money on housing. We really don't spend a lot of time and energy on code enforcement, which is which I've already mentioned. We also don't spend a lot of effort on how we go about stabilizing homes and keeping people in their homes and helping them age in place, as well as adding new housing stock. A community like Silverton hadn't had a new housing start since 2006 when I started here. So we have very few lots that were available, and so now we're starting to see infill activity occurring there as well. But it's nice to see new housing opportunities as well as maintenance of existing housing and demolition where it's needed. The third thing that I think of as a best practice or something that first suburbs can do is to intervene in the marketplace. And that is a different type of economic development activity. And so let me describe it. In a perfect world, the city government would not need to do a whole lot to get the free hand of the market, the Adam Smith free hand, working perfectly. We might need to do some public infrastructure to support private development, but that's about it. In the context of a lot of first suburbs where the built environment has been set in place 80, 90 years ago, and it doesn't really work for today's marketplace, the government itself, in my opinion, needs to intervene and change the land use. And that involves actually assembling land in some cases, land banking, and figuring out new ways to generate economic activity. And sorry, my phone was ringing. If you're not happy with the way your economy is, then you have to physically change the built environment, which is really hard because it involves usually tearing something down and acquiring land. But I think it's the only way to really change the built environment if the free market is not going to do it on its own. And in many first suburbs, the free market's not going to do it. The free market trajectory is downward. So the intervention is absolutely necessary. And then the fourth principle, I would say, really relates to equity and inclusion. So a big part of the change in the demographics in the first suburbs, and you hear about this in the national theater of politics, right? Suburbs have become a lot more diverse, racially, ethnically, socially, and economically. Places like Silverton that were intentionally inclusive before I was born are very successful because we didn't have the same degree of white flight, and we have found a way in places like Cleveland Heights and Shaker Heights and Silverton to be much more intentional about inclusion. White flight still occurs, it really does, and I think communities, governments need to be intentional about inclusion and equity. And welcoming to people from different backgrounds. And this includes, in many parts of the country, people who immigrate from a different country used to go right to the central city. Now they go to the suburbs. So you see immigration waves from countries and locations of the world that we're not that terribly familiar with, whether it's Somali or Ethiopian, or there's a huge Tibetan population up in Fairfield, Ohio, which is just like, I don't know how they decided to go there, but it's lovely, but I just don't know why you'd go from Tibet to Fairfield. So it's important that we focus on those principles of equity and inclusion. And that's especially true as we talk about densification and new urbanism. The suburbs, and again, this is part of the national conversation, I can't simultaneously be concerned about declining population in Silverton and still deeply wedded to single family land use. So I have become a proponent of where it makes sense, and it makes sense in parts of Silverton and not in other parts of Silverton, to change the land use, to change the density, and to allow for a mixture of land uses, including that residential component that I mentioned earlier. And doing that in a way that's smart, that's inclusive, that has a workforce and affordable housing component. Those are key principles that I think we in government need to champion and lead. And ultimately, not every community is going to be successful in that because nativism is very powerful, but I think that should be our endeavor. And so that's what we've done, Christina, in Silverton, projects related to those 4 principles, intentionally including our residents in discussions, including when we outsourced the policing to the sheriff's office. We had the 2 largest community meetings I've ever been involved in related to that. It was a hot topic. It was emotional. But at the end of the meetings, the facilitation was such that everyone saw that this is going to happen and this is going to be good, and let's get on board with it.
Thanks, Tom.
Sorry, my mute was broken. That really reminds me of like the strong towns argument, for the most part. But our next question is for Eric. And Eric, your city is investing in planning for both public art and your waterfront, with special attention being paid to quality public spaces. Tell us a little bit about these efforts and what you think they will contribute to your city.
Sure, thanks, John. And before I transition to that question, I just want to say I really enjoyed Tom's dialogue on the previous question. And Sandusky, while not a first suburb, is very similar, I think, kind of demographically to a lot of first suburbs. And I couldn't agree more in the principles that he talked about. And we've really worked hard in different ways to try to engage our residents and really refocus that conversation, but also those investments in things like code compliance. We passed a rental registration legislation several years ago that has allowed us to really build a code compliance division from like 2 to 6. And we've also really increased our recreation investments and focused creating a youth position to do programming in neighborhoods. And then the additional housing funds, which I mentioned earlier, have been really critical to sort of, if the code compliance becomes the stick, that becomes the carrot to help attract that investment. And you don't see it in the same way that you see the changes that are more dramatic in a concentrated area within the downtown, but they are just as important. And in the long term, those neighborhood investments along with the investments of our school system. The Sandusky City Schools passed the bond issue and have constructed 2 or are in the process of building a 3rd new elementary school. Really, those are the sort of 3 legs of the stool that we think about as the schools, the downtown, and the neighborhoods that together will kind of to bring Sandusky back. And so I really enjoyed Tom talking about that, and look forward to continuing to learn from him and others and to do that work ourselves. But as it relates to the public art and to the waterfront investments, when we look at what are Sandusky's unique assets, we know that we're a community that is anchoring a region that brings over 10 million visitors every year. And we know that our city proper, outside of the portion of it that includes Cedar Point, is getting a very low market share of that, in spite of the fact that we have this historic downtown and these ferry services, which really with the ferry services, because we had dedicated the waterfront to basically just parking the cars that used them, we became a place that people came to pass through on their way to somewhere else, and not a place that they would stop. And so we said, as part of that bicentennial vision planning, how do we really take back our waterfront and our public spaces, not in ways that eliminate the transportation services that they provide, whether that was parking cars or ferry operations, but how do we build on them through placemaking and public art, and how do we take back those public spaces so that they can serve our residents, most of whom, or a lot of whom, aren't even arriving in cars at all. And really the focal point of that was the creation of a public art program. And what we did is we set aside 1% of our total admissions tax annually, which is about $50,000. And we set that aside for a public art program. And we created a public arts and cultural commission that our city commission appointed that works with our planning staff. And they partner with Designing Local in a community-based planning program to say, okay, how do we not only invest that $50,000 a year, which doesn't seem like much, but when added up can get a few projects done. But in addition to how do we leverage those funds with outside partners and philanthropies to really do placemaking projects. And we've done a few of those in neighborhoods. In one of our waterfront neighborhoods that you wouldn't necessarily know was waterfront when you kind of drove by it. We did a giant fish hook that kind of comes into the ground. We've got murals welcoming people to other neighborhoods. We put a mural downtown. And it's really helped to activate the space. And I think we're just getting started with those public art investments and what they can yield more broadly for the surrounding community. And then the investments that we've made in public realm. I'll just give 2 examples. The Jackson Street Pier and the Sandusky Bay Pathway. We redid Shoreline Drive this year. We took that from a waterfront street that, because Sandusky was an industrial town, had been our back of house. All of the buildings that faced Shoreline, it was really their back door, and their front door was Water Street, which was removed 1 block from the waterfront. And so and there was a wide street because it used to accommodate rail for industry. And so cars went by too fast. There was no real place, since we did a streetscaping plan for that mile that included adding a 10-foot multi-use pathway, which is the mile 0 marker of the Sandusky Bay Pathway. We sold the naming rights, or we got a grant for the naming rights to that to a local foundation, White and Weaver, which really helped to do the pathway components of that. We buried utilities that blocked views from the water. We created dumpster enclosure areas so that each individual building didn't need its own dumpster or back of house operations. And we really narrowed the traffic lanes down from, I think, 13-foot lanes to 10-foot lanes to accommodate the amenities and the pedestrianism. And it has been transformative to the point where we are seeing investments along both that section of the pathway. A building just sold, which is going to be a new restaurant with rooftop bar. Our landmark commission just last night, a building that was redone to house our Convention and Visitors Bureau and Destination Marketing Organization, Lake Erie Shores and Islands, which moved off the sort of the corridor on the way into town to a downtown location. That 3rd floor has been purchased by a local developer who's going to put a rooftop bar and restaurant on top of that building. We had a boutique hotel developed along that street, an outdoor shop which runs kayaks. It's incredible. There have been millions of dollars invested. And one of the things is, just this past September, the county did a pedestrian counts at several intersections without the county. And that Shoreline Drive at the center of the Sandusky Bay Pathway had 800 pedestrians that used that as an 8-hour period on a Saturday in mid-September in the midst of COVID. And that is a dramatic increase, and nowhere else at the many other locations looked at the county even came close to that. So we're bringing people to these spaces through these investments. We're attracting private investment with these investments. And then finally, the Jackson Street Pier itself, which turned that 300-space parking lot into a 100-space lot with a 360-degree boardwalk that was handicap accessible. It was safe for pedestrians. We have a year-round market pavilion. We have space dedicated for concerts and sunset viewing. We had planned a complete year of programming with a lot of partners this year with concerts and movies and all of these things. We weren't able to do any of that with COVID. But even with the lack of programming this year, hundreds of people showed up at the pier every single day for every single sunset, and we had new businesses emerge. An ice cream shop showed up, other food trucks showed up there, and it really became this amazing, diverse display of young Sanduskians, old Sanduskians, people who live in town, people coming from out of town, and it really demonstrated, people want to be on the water, they want to be in dynamic public spaces, and that's a public space that is accessible to everyone and is continuing to attract investment, and we can't wait to program that hopefully this coming spring and summer to see if we can grow on that from there. But those investments have been, catalytic and transformative to how we view ourselves as a community, to how we can build community in Sandusky, and I really can't wait to see how we build on those over time with our new downtown plan, which we had hoped to have finished by the end of this year.
Very nice. Yeah, lakefront sunsets are the best, and I think being able to celebrate on public ground right there, that's a programming event also itself that occurs almost every day.
Tom, our next and last question is for you, and I wanted to also say, in answering your question, I know that you have also had some successful efforts with public art, specifically murals, tied to some of your economic development work, and so if you can weave that into your start off, I think that would be a nice dialogue. But the question, specific question for you is, you've recently started moving toward the implementation of a community development technique whose mission is to use land readjustment strategies to empower local communities economically while transforming areas of low density into mixed-use walkable developments. If you could tell us a little bit about this effort and what you have and what you hope to accomplish with it.
Sure. So first, amplify Eric's point about public art. We also started a public art program where we set aside 1% of our capital budget into a reserve that accumulates year over year. And we have done 2 public art projects in the last 3 years. And we'll set aside about $8,000 next year, which isn't enough to do public art, but then in 2022, and we'll probably leverage that with some extra philanthropic money. So it really is impactful, especially now that there's a second piece of public art. People can say, oh, wow, there's a sense of place here. Silverton has not only a mural, which is cool, but now we have this new sculpture that's very interesting. And I think it's essential. The land readjustment model that Christina mentioned is something that I've only become aware of in the last 6 months, but I think it's tremendously powerful for the kind of interventionist economic development that I mentioned earlier. Silverton, we've identified 2 blocks along Montgomery Road in and around our downtown, our central business district, that is on Montgomery Road side. It is obsolete commercial space. There's a bar, there's a mechanic shop, there's a hardware store, a vacant spot, an old electronic shop, all of which are functionally obsolete. And then on the back side of those same blocks are some decent residential, and that's getting into more of our historic original original village where the older homes are. And then there's this hodgepodge of uses in between, including some outdated multifamily. And so we've identified this as these 2 blocks, which is about 6 acres in size, as ripe for redevelopment, ripe for mixed use and densification. So in November 10th, there's 35 different property owners. We're inviting them to a meeting, socially distanced, where we will present to them a possible alternative to the existing land configuration. And that would be what's called a land trust and land readjustment. And the idea behind it is, the goal, I think, is to do a land assemblage to increase the density of the land, but not necessarily displace the existing property owners. Instead of them just simply selling their property to a developer or to the village, the idea is you will form a land trust and you will deed your property to land trust, and you will essentially still own your land through your ownership in the land trust. And the land will then be reconfigured. The village will be involved in working with a developer to change the zoning and to change the land use, including demolition of a good portion of the built environment. And as the redevelopment takes place, one of the requirements is that the developer build new townhomes for the existing residents who are part of the land trust. So if you can imagine yourself as one of the 35 property owners, and not all of them live there, some of them are commercial properties, but I own, let's say, $100,000 home or a $200,000 home in this area. I suppose I have a mortgage and I have $100,000 on my $200,000 home. The developer will come in, pay off the mortgage. I'll have to move for a year into a brand new apartment built by the developer. And then at the end of that year, I get a brand new townhome out of the deal. And I own that free and clear without the debt, as well as I own a portion of the development itself. So it's a very different model for how the people who live there can stay there. And this is really important on issues of race and equity. As much success as we have over the Rhine in Cincinnati, one of the problems with any gentrification is the displacement of existing residents. And so this model is attempting to try and correct for that, as well as allowing these residents to be part of the development itself and to potentially build wealth through doing it, because you would be a part owner in this land trust. We're working with a couple of developers who are different from your typical developer, because not every developer would want to do this. The developer, what the developer would do is pay off everybody's debt and then get a ground lease for X number of years to be determined, build a building and get that land rent-free, recover their investment costs and make a reasonable profit. And what it does for the developer, I think, is it de-risks it quite a bit, because they know what their assemblage costs are going to be up front, and they know the village is going to approve the zoning in place, because all of that is baked into the process before they really start spending serious money on land assemblage by paying off those debts. So we think it solves big, important problems for all three major parties that are involved in the redevelopment process. For the homeowner, it allows them to build wealth and stay in the community if they want. For the developer, it de-risks it by defining what's going to happen before they really start investing serious money. And for the village, we ultimately are part of the upfront negotiations with the residents and with the developer to basically approve the zoning in place. And we also own some of the land in the development itself. So it's an interesting model. I'll let you know if it works. We'll find out in November and December when we have these public meetings.
Yeah, we'll have to bring you back to another discussion early next year so you can give us an update. So that concludes kind of our initial discussion today. And so we have some questions from our participants. And first one is for either of you, Tom or Eric. With the possible changes in migration due to COVID, what are your expectations for impact to be able to counter population decline? And two, are you thinking about other types of infrastructure expansion, like broadband or other kind of technical infrastructure? So whoever would like to answer.
I can start with that one. We're watching COVID very closely. Sandusky's been really hard hit from a tourism perspective by COVID, because Cedar Point opened late, and then with a much more limited ability to welcome guests. And so while we've had to deal with the budget issues of that, we're doing that on a day-to-day basis and trying to be forward thinking as to what this might mean for small cities like Sandusky. And I think a lot of the investments that we talked about earlier in making Sandusky a much more livable, walkable place that is very affordable compared to larger cities. Even close by larger cities like Cleveland and Columbus, the price per square foot to buy a home or to rent a home is much higher than it is in Sandusky. And so we've looked at, okay, with folks having an ability to potentially work more remotely, how do we position ourselves? Or for those who are, we're somewhat of a empty nester in retirement market for second homes. The question is, can we convince more folks to have that second home here to sort of get away from the larger cities? But I think we're very focused on what we can do to attract more remote workers, which we're already seeing some of that trend in the previous years before COVID, as well as new migration to the area. And then as far as connectivity-based infrastructure, it's critically important to us. One of the things that we've really tried to focus on, we run the transit system for Erie County from the city of Sandusky. And so public transportation for our workforce has been critical. We have very remotely located institutions of higher education, and the service jobs, which are predominant in this area, tend to be removed from the city. And so we try to connect our residents, because we're the home of most of the lower income housing or the workforce housing, to those opportunities for education by connecting the bus line to Bowling Green State University, by increasing our bus frequency on Route 250, and doing the campus downtown. Digital is something that I think we need to, we are not a connected city from an internet perspective. And in our next strategic planning process, I think that's something that we're absolutely going to have to focus on, is how do we partner with other stakeholders, both from a business development perspective, particularly for the many young Sanduskians who've been working and learning remotely. How do we make sure they have better connections so that educational gap doesn't grow larger with new technologies and more remote learning opportunities happening across the country?
Tom, do you want to add anything to that?
Just one thought for what it's worth. It may not be worth much. I have yet to be convinced that COVID is going to have long-term implications for land use other than cratering retail and potentially reducing office space demand. But for how people live, I remain bullish on the inner ring around central cities, mainly because I think as we start to address climate change and change our lifestyle related to climate issues and reducing our consumption, that we will want to be closer to central cities, which is contrary sort of to the idea of physically distancing. I've read some stuff where people want to be away from populations, and I totally get that during a pandemic, but I think the overriding trend is going to be continuing to be towards densification. So I'm not ready to declare long-term changes in land use because of COVID. I think that's to be determined.
First ring suburbs also seem to be like the sweet spot where they have like just enough spacing out and nature access, but also you can walk pretty close to anything in your neighborhood business district. Like the idea of a 15-minute community, for example, is becoming very prevalent. That's mostly a lot of city first ring suburbs.
And I think small cities and first ring suburbs, I think, have a lot of common with that trend.
Yes.
I don't think cities are going away, but I do think it carves a unique market niche for smaller cities as compared to, say, coastal cities, as well as those first ring suburbs that offer more of that connectivity with a slightly, less large, the constraints that a larger city provides at times.
You're right, and a lot, especially in the Midwest, there are a lot of old towns and cities that have the built form of most urban cities in America, and you get all of that access and charm as well. We've got one more question from our Q&A, and I think we have time for one more question. Why not convert vacant old houses into incubator retail spaces, which would then lower your access point as well as to foster engagement and bring a more sustainable process to redevelopment? This is a type of house as retail space has worked well in St. Paul and Boston, San Francisco, and could also allow for effective infill of village planning to existing infrastructure without any demolition required. And you can also change the land use to increase density for infill if you have an issue of lot size. So basically the question is, use vacant old houses as retail incubator spaces. You've done any of that?
It's a hard question, Eric, so I thought you should take it. But also, from a retail standpoint, I would think around your lakeshore, you would have more quaint old houses that now are bed and breakfasts or boutiques and that sort of thing. So not just trying to find.
We're actually seeing a major push in our central business district and the surrounding neighborhood is the only place where, as of right, things like B&Bs and VRBOs are legal. We have an overlay district that we created because we have some neighborhoods that really want them and other neighborhoods that don't. It's the VRBO. One overlay get created in the last few years, but we're seeing a lot of conversion to that sort of lighter commercial space because we're an older sort of streetcar-ish community. We have a lot of underused retail, existing commercial mixed-use space along our corridors that are also struggling, and we'd like to see those come back as mixed use, et cetera. But I think anything we can creatively do to bring back, to build equity with our residents and to bring back some of this older housing stock, we'd be very interested in that. And I see the question about the zoning code, about duplexes, triplexes, and quads, and what that means. That's something we're paying really close attention to. When I was in Ohio City, we had a really good alley system, and we're very much pushing, even kind of piloting carriage house type models to add affordability and density to those units. Right now, Sandusky is not well zoned for either accessory dwelling units or duplexes. I think we are okay on the duplex side, but not the accessory dwelling unit side. And we've had a lot of talk with our planning department about how we can bring creative solutions to housing, whether that's more commercial use or finding creative ways to get accessory units into those, and something we're focused on, but haven't really dove into in a transactional way just yet.
Have either of you guys dealt with any of this type of upzoning that has excluded single-family zone homes at all?
Yeah, I mean, our mixed-use redevelopment in Silverton does not include any land for single-family homes. There are several still within that zoning district. It's bigger than just this redevelopment, but those are legal non-conforming land uses by the planned mixed-use development that we did. And some of those residents were not excited about that, I'll be honest. But they, I think we're going to have to get comfortable as planners, city managers, and public officials talking about increased zoning and densification, whether it is sort of the infill or granny flats or accessory use structures, which I think we should probably rethink why we're opposed to that. I mean, it might not make sense, but there might be lots of places where that really is a way to increase density without really changing the built environment. But when you get into infilling within a traditionally single family neighborhood, I am also a proponent of having some protections for those. And that relates to where the housing values and housing stock is sufficiently valuable and in such good enough condition that we probably need to protect those single family zoning districts. That's my bias with my Silverton context, but I welcome other ideas.
And I know we're out of town, and I want to add to that. I think that housing is so complicated, and every community is so different as to where it stands with demand, et cetera, that I do think a lot of inner-ring suburbs and smaller cities, our challenge is oftentimes in upkeeping the housing stock that we have rather than prices getting out of control. And so to me, I love the idea of accessory dwelling units, but I'm also a huge proponent of maintaining a primary dwelling unit on most single family lots, because the market that we have the hardest time in Sandusky attracting is that family age market, because we're losing out to them to our more suburban and rural communities that sit just outside of Sandusky. And I wouldn't want to see a move away from having units that are appropriate for families so we can continue to attract them back in partnership with the schools. But I do think it creates a lot more options for people of all ages and affordability for the owner of that primary unit. If it is got an accessory unit or two that they could put above the garage, in the basement, in the attic, et cetera. And so I think that's the balance that we're looking for in Sandusky, is having a really good family-friendly housing stock that continues to be affordable, providing a lot of options within that single-family use to on the edges to add more units in ways that can create some housing for people who really need it.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Cool. Well, that's we've gone a little bit over, but I think we've had a really great Q&A. And this has been a very engaging several different set of topics that you both have covered. Tom Carroll, Village of Silverton, Eric Wobster, City of Sandusky, thank you very much for being our guests on the webcast today. Christina, thank you for co-hosting, and thanks everybody for attending. We look forward to having more conversations with these guys and everybody else in the future. So watch your email, and we'll send out the details for our next Midwest Changemakers when we've got that ironed out. So thank you very much, everybody, and have a good day.
Thank you. Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Eric.
Thank you.
All right.